Hi, I'm Seabud, and this is the second part of my tutorial series on CS2 asset creation entirely in Blender. So in the first part we have already modeled out our materials, which will be part of our texture, and in this part we will take care of figuring out a system of how to put the right colors and values on them. So while the modeling part is mainly relevant for the pattern of our textures and the height map, our material setup will be important for all the other aspects, which are part of the final textures. We will mainly work in Blender's shader editor here, but our setup will actually be quite different from a lot of the regular material setups that you would do in Blender. So when we go and preview our materials, we can see that it still looks pretty empty, mostly whites. And to change this, we can go to the shading tab, and this is the workspace in which we will be editing our materials, and we can still see them here. And then this bottom section will be the part where we actually make the edits. But first, let's get an overview of the different textures and what they display and how, and also how the game will need them in order to work. And again, the wiki gives a pretty good documentation of this, so I recommend reading this through before continuing. And if we go to the asset creation page, here we can see what texture maps are asked for by the game. And then here there's a breakdown of what each texture map contains in detail, and also not only what it contains, but also on which color channel the specific information is put. And this is very important for us to know how we need to assemble the textures and then export them from Blender in order to be able to input them into the game right away. You can see that the textures on the left are the ones that we are creating in Blender, and then we are packing them into this pack of textures on the right. And for the base color, we are literally rendering out our material sheet that we're modeling. And you can see there is everything that we are also putting into the rendering. So there's a bit of ambient occlusion, for example, in this, but that really depends on the art style that you want. You don't have to include this. And then combined with the alpha map, this will become the base color. And you can see that for the final texture, I've made this a tiny bit lighter, but it is essentially the same thing. Now for the normal map, we are actually starting with a height map because we cannot render normal maps right away, but we can very easily output a height information as a value. So that is, the black parts are further in the back and the white parts are further in front. Or actually, I think it's the other way around. And then that can be transformed quite nicely into a normal map, which is a bit more of a complex representation. Now for the mask map, we actually have three things that we will put into that. That is metallic and coat and glossiness. And these three maps will be put on the red, green and alpha channel of our final texture. And then the final result will be this sort of alien green thing that's not really readable anymore, but the game has all the info it needs in that. And it's quite the same for the control mask. This one contains three masks, which are just like a black and white representation of which parts of the texture are affected by color variations, and these will be put on the red, green and blue channels and then combined. And in my project I do not have any emission, so my emissive map is empty right now, but it would be combined just as a RGB channel without any touches really. So the first thing we can do is we can actually apply a material for each one of the different materials we've already modeled. And so on my 3D model, I've already put a set of materials, which I can just reuse here. So I will just apply all the materials to the parts that correspond to the model. And that's a very quick thing to do. And since everything that is shown on this texture sheet will also be rendered, we also need to not forget about putting a material for the background, because that also actually needs information for all of our color channels, even if that's mostly just black, but we need to include it as a material. And now our texture map already looks a lot more sophisticated, since we have the colors in there, which is not really necessary to add, but it's a bit more visually pleasing. And then if we render this out, we can see that there's still no information about any of the materials. And also the big issue is that we are, when we render this out, only really getting one layer of information. So the magical feature that allows us to put different texture maps as the output is called AOV, and we can find this in the view layer properties under shader AOV. And this is a little drop down to which we can just add new attributes, and we can also put whether they are color or values. And then for this one, I can just, for example, rename it to CS2 base color. And then everything that will be put into here will become our base color. And we can do the same thing with all of the other ones as well. And we just need to state whether we want those to be output as an RGB color value or just a normal value. And for most of them, except the base color and the emissive texture, this will be just a value. And now when we hit F12 and we render our image, we actually have the option to go to view layer, and then instead of combined, select the different AOV outputs that we just created. And that allows us to actually render a lot of images at the same time. And the next step is that we need to go into our material editor and we need to add an AOV output. And here we can already see our AOVs that we created show up. And so we do the same thing here. We just create one output per AOV channel / texture channel that we need. And we can also see the right type of output is already showing. So whether that's color or value. And that means we just need to plug in the right sort of output into the right AOV. One thing that we should be doing as well, because we want to actually reuse this for all of our materials, is that we group it, and we can remove the group output here because this will be our final group. And then we just drag all of the correct AOV output channels or data formats into our group input so that they show up outside of the group, just like this. And we can also rename the outputs to be a bit more visually clear what they actually are. And for each one of them, we also have a menu, and I recommend putting for all of the value outputs a factor so that we have a slider actually in the node group, and that makes it a bit more nice to actually set the value. And I'll just quickly rename this to CS2 outputs, and I will also change the node group type so that the color is a bit more nice. And there we go, that's our node group that we need for the outputs. Our height map is a bit of a special one because the height map calculation is actually something that is always the same. So we might as well include it in our node group here. And the way we do this is by using a position node and separating for just the height value, which in our case is the z value because we modeled flat on the ground. And we can put this into a map range node and then essentially define a range in which all of the values will be crunched to 0 to 1, which is what we want. So we connect this up, put this into a nice little frame, and then in order to be able to have control over what this sort of area looks like or height looks like, in which we want to have our height gradient, we can connect the min and max up to our group inputs. And to find our range, we can just look sideways at our texture and see how much the biggest parts stick out. And it looks here as if that would be around 25 centimeters. I will also just rename these new inputs and delete the height map so that everything is a bit more visually clear, because we want to reuse this node group and hopefully never have to touch it again. And with that done, our last job here is to simply, let's set other values to 0 and this one to 0.25, and to just copy this node group and then paste it into every material so we can control the output easily. And if we check our AOV layers now, we can actually see that there is starting to appear some information. The height map is actually already done. It's as it's supposed to be. And we could be reusing this now for our calculation. And that's already it with the tutorial. So this part is done, and next up is to create our actual materials, fill these up and connect them to the AOV outputs. So that will be the next video.